Hello, my name's Ben Sheen. I'm a member of the editorial team here at Stratfor, and I'm joined by military analyst Paul Floyd, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. So Paul, as a young boy growing up in Western Germany on a military airbase, I have clear memories of going into Berlin, which at the time was a city bisected by the Iron Curtain. The Cold War seems like a good place to start with NATO. What were the origins of the alliance?
Well, coming out of World War II and moving into the Cold War, there was an obvious threat emanating from communist Soviet Union. And so the U.S. wrapped what was remained of Western Europe into the security organization to basically prevent any further incursion into Europe. And it was kind of highlighted by obviously the Iron Curtain, but that line was held by conventional forces of hundreds of thousands of troops, tens of thousands of pieces of equipment, forward deployed American personnel on hundreds of bases through Germany. And really, we saw the same thing on the exact opposite side. So it was really just a conventional standoff across the Fulda Gap.
Well, that standoff lasted for only so long, and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and then the Soviet Union a couple of years later in 91, that really changed things for the alliance. How did NATO respond to that, and how did it seek to grow beyond the demise of its traditional adversary?
Right. So, I mean, the Cold War, NATO was designed as this collective defensive agreement for these nations, and there was a clear existential threat right across the line there. And as the Cold War ended, it really was the huge turning point for NATO, because now it had no strategic focus, no existential enemy that it was built around and structured around. And so it kind of struggled for a mission for years, I would say, and has kind of dipped its toe into these different interventions, but what we've seen in those conventional military structures I was talking about, because they're so expensive to have standing all the time, and defense spending in Europe in general, as part of NATO, has steadily declined. These forces have been withdrawn, and now it's basically a shell of its former self in the sense of conventional power that's under the NATO framework that's ready to actually do anything. So NATO is kind of transformed from this large standing deterrent defensive force that was on the line to this rapid reaction force, and really kind of a leadership structure and a logistic structure that can be applied to multinational missions where all the member states agree to do something, like anti-piracy patrols, where we can rotate many different naval ships from many different countries, NATO members, at any given time.
Now, you mentioned a good point there, which is the fact that there needs to be a degree of unanimity within NATO. Countries need to agree. Now, just getting the British, the French, and the Germans to agree is one thing, but when you have 28 member countries, that's difficult. And you touched upon the idea of interoperability and the fact that NATO is seeking to standardize across the alliance. How, or to what extent has it achieved that?
To the expansion question, NATO kind of, I would say, because it didn't have this strategic focus anymore, it didn't have that enemy in the Soviet Union anymore, and it expanded into four Soviet states, contrary to promises it had made to Russia. So it actually, Russia felt threatened, at least in the future, of what NATO could be on its doorstep. But also, by expanding the number of members from 12 originally to this 28 that are standing now, but you need unanimous consent to really have any kind of action under the NATO framework, you've really limited what NATO can do. You really diluted its ability to kind of be this forward-looking, rapid reaction that can take maybe unpopular decisions, because it just takes one member state who has slightly different interests to really blow up the entire alliance framework. And so we've actually seen that. You have this geographic fault lines within NATO now, where the eastern states, which are now closer to Russia, are feeling more threatened, are much more focused on Russia and Russia as a threat, versus Western Europe, which is still, right now, because of actions in Ukraine, maybe be focused on Russia, but that probably is temporary at best, depending on what Russia does. They're not necessarily so interested. And to make it matters even worse, the infrastructure for NATO, the old infrastructure, is still kind of on the western part of Europe. Those are the most powerful military nations are in Western Europe, and the eastern part NATO members are the weakest militarily. So they not only do they feel the most threatened, but they actually need the resources and the money and the cost and the units coming over from Western Europe, and they don't necessarily want to provide that because they have other concerns right now, such as a financial crisis in the EU. Speaking of interoperability, that's probably the single biggest legacy of NATO. I would say the most important part of it is the idea that the fact is, if Western Europe had the will to do it, and the United States has the will to do it, we can actually push forces all the way over into Eastern NATO members, and because of that interoperability. And so I would say that's the most important part, and probably what Russia fears the most out of NATO. They don't fear the Baltic states themselves, but they fear the fact that they're in NATO, they're that close to St. Petersburg and Moscow, and that the United States, with the right impetus, could actually bring over its entire military might and plant it down and work in some kind of capacity to facilitate the Baltic military.
So with the developing situation in Ukraine, how do you think this changes the picture for NATO? And you mentioned the idea that there are security providers, the larger contributors such as America, and you've got NATO consumers such as the Baltic states and the ones that are in the most risk from proximity to Russia. So how do we go forward with increased Russian aggression against Ukraine and people looking towards NATO and saying what's going to happen?
Well, Ukraine is it's still in a gray area. Russia has not crossed a certain line that's been so overt that it's completely gelled all of NATO together in cohesive action against it. We've seen lots of small little bits and pieces, companies off in the Baltic states and in Poland, different overflights, some aircraft being moved, some ships in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. All these none of this is serious combat power yet. And it would really kind of depend on what Russia does and how much of a more permanent threat Russia tries to make itself to actually conceivably bring NATO together and give it a political will and solidify it again with that strategic focused threat. But if Russia plays its hand in a different way and tends to be more reserved and kind of keeps its actions under a certain line, I think the geographic tensions that we've already seen in NATO and the size of NATO and some of that strategic waffling we've seen because of the size of NATO will continue and kind of slowly continue that loss of effectiveness that NATO used to have like it did in the Cold War.
Paul, I think that's about all we've got time for, but thank you very much for joining me.
Absolutely.
If you'd like to read more about NATO, look forward to our NATO series, which is in 3 parts, publishing soon.